The morning light slid down the glass face of the tower like a pale river, and the lobby was a lake of marble that reflected shoes and badges and the confident stride of people who trusted doors to open for them. And in the middle of that polished tide, a man in a faded green uniform paused with a small metal lunchbox held like a prayer, and he looked up toward the mezzanine, where banners declared in proud letters a fellowship name that promised access and future and belonging. And his breath came slowly and evenly, because he had been up through the night polishing floors, and now he wanted only to sit where he could see his daughter step into her own light. And he stepped toward the rope that made an invisible line between the powerful and the politely tolerated, and a security officer began to speak to him kindly. But before the sentence found shape, the air split with a voice that was practiced in giving orders and accustomed to being obeyed, as a millionaire chief executive cut through the lobby with a certainty that looked like speed, and he pointed with a slight flip of his wrist, the way a conductor dismisses a wrong note, and he said, "You do not belong here." And the word "you" struck the marble and jumped, and the lobby grew very quiet, in the way crowded places grow quiet when something is happening that nobody wants to claim. And the man in green did not flinch. He simply answered with a steady tone that had carried him through 1,000 small humiliations and 1,000 ordinary sunrises. "I am here for my daughter," and he tapped the lunchbox with 2 fingers as if to point to proof and memory and promise. And the executive gave a short breath that almost laughed and said, "Your daughter can watch from the public platform. Staff and service people use the side corridors." He looked at the rope, and then at the security officer, and then back to the man and said, "I said, you do not belong here, and you are holding up the flow." And the man in green remained still, and the security officer shifted because he knew the man by name and by the quiet way he left the break room cleaner than he found it. And he tried to speak the word Rafael, but the executive lifted a hand like a stop sign and added that this was not a family event for those who work off the clock, and that the cameras would be here for our fellows and our brand, not for a janitor who wandered into a shot that was already framed. And the words were precise and cutting, and a few phones rose as if pulled by the same string, and a young woman with a lanyard appeared on the mezzanine and called Dad with the unmistakable mix of pride and alarm that happens when the world steps between 2 people who have always found each other. And the man in green looked up, and his face softened, and he lifted the lunchbox a little so she could see it. And then the executive said, "If you do not step back right now, I will have you escorted out, and I will be calling your contractor, because we cannot have this kind of disruption." And he said the word disruption with a professional polish that wrapped contempt in efficiency. And the man in green said, "I will step wherever you need me to step, but I will not leave until my daughter is called." And the executive nodded to the security officer who moved in, the way a man moves when his paycheck is pulled by one force and his conscience by another. And the crowd made that almost silent sound of everyone pretending not to look while looking. And the executive added, for the benefit of the people who were now definitely watching, that our success depends on order, and that people need to know their place, and that there are standards here. And he gestured at the helix of chrome that curved over the lobby and caught a dozen versions of his profile, and one reflection of the man in green that seemed to stand taller than any of the executive faces rippling across the sculpture. And he said to the security officer, "Take him outside now and tell his supervisor that Helios will not tolerate this," and an assistant had already lifted a phone and was tapping messages like small hammers, and a man from the cleaning company named Victor was answering in careful phrases that sounded like "I am on it." And the man in green breathed once and twice, and did not resist when the officer placed a hand near his elbow and suggested they step toward the side door, and he only said softly to the air, "I am here for my daughter." and the words drifted upward, as if words could climb the stair faster than anyone and reach a heart, before fear closed it. The ceremony began on the mezzanine with a mutter of microphones and a program manager tapping a stand, as if sound check could fix what pride had broken, and the executive strode to the stage as if the last 5 minutes had been a glitch and not a moment. And he smiled with practiced warmth, and he spoke about access and grit and merit and stories from his own life. He avoided specifics, but everyone knew he liked to say he had come from less and built more, and the crowd applauded because that is what crowds do. And yet a thread of unease ran through the room like a hairline crack in glass, and the man in green stood where he could see through a gap by the service elevator with the security officer hovering close, but not touching. And the daughter stood with the other finalists, her hands cupped around a folded program that had already become a talisman, and the executive glided through a line about how we celebrate excellence, not entitlement. And in the next breath, he cast his eyes toward the shadows below and said, "We also must be vigilant against distractions and chaos and opportunists who take advantage of open doors to insert themselves into occasions that are not meant for them." And he let the sentence hang, and the implication was as sharp as a blade wrapped in silk, and a few heads turned and then turned back, and no one said anything, because the safest thing to do in rooms like this is to let the most powerful person write the story while you nod on the margins. The security officer who stood with the man in green was named Omar, and he came from a family that had taught him to see beyond uniforms, because his mother had worn one too, and he whispered, "If you let me walk with you to the door, I will hold a spot outside so you can see through the glass." And the man said, "I will not make trouble." And Omar said, "I know, and that is why this is so hard." And down the hall, a man from the cleaning company hurried toward them with that tight look of a supervisor who fears losing a contract. And he said, "Rafael, we need to talk right now." And he tried to angle his body so his words would not carry. And he said, "The client is upset, and I have to suspend you pending review." And the man in green listened with attention, not panic, and he nodded and said, "You do what you must do, and I will do what I must do." And the supervisor looked confused as if he had expected pleading, and the man offered his badge and the keys to the supply room as if returning something borrowed, and he said, "Please tell the night crew to check the third-floor machine because it drifts left, and the pads will wear if they do not compensate." And the supervisor took the keys with a small bow of his head, because dignity in some people calls up dignity in others, even when fear is running high. On stage, the executive began to move from the theme of access to the proclamation of partnerships and future rounds of funding, and how investors understood the vision, and in the shadow of those words, the daughter fought to keep her focus, and she recalled the mornings her father had placed a note next to her cereal bowl with messages written in careful block letters that always ended with the same two words, "Keep going." And she felt the heat rise in her throat and pushed it down, because she would not give this man the power to make her cry on a stage that was supposed to be hers. And in that second, a tall woman in a navy suit slipped onto the side of the stage and handed a folded paper to the program manager, who read with widening eyes, and then crossed to the executive and tipped it toward him. And he glanced down, and then again, and the color in his face changed the way sky changes when a storm turns on a hinge, and he faltered for a breath and smiled wider in the way people do when something is cracking, and they hope a bigger smile will hold the pieces together, and the paper had been written the night before. And its words were simple but heavy, and they announced that as of that morning, a community trust using a holding company with an unreadable name had acquired a controlling stake in Helios from a departing founder who was done with the grind and ready to be a mentor, and that the trust had appointed a chair and that the chair would address the company today at the fellowship event, because the symbolism mattered, and because stories need the right rooms, and the executive looked to the back where board members had taken seats with the patience of people who knew secrets, and he swallowed nothing because there was no water, and he said to the program manager later, and the manager said, "No, now," and the executive straightened in a way that announced he would not be surprised by anything. Again, even as surprise kept coming, the program manager stepped to the microphone and said, "There is a brief change to the schedule," and the words fell into the hush like small stones. And he said, "We welcome a representative of Lumen Harbor," the name that most people only recognized from filings, and the security officer Omar took one step backward because he felt a shift, and in that moment the man in green walked from the shadow beside the elevator, not hurried and not slow, and he set the lunchbox on a ledge, the way a man sets down what he has kept safe, and he looked to his daughter, and then to the executive, and his face was unreadable, in the way the most controlled faces are unreadable, not because they feel nothing, but because they are choosing where to put the feeling. And he climbed the side steps, and the program manager offered him the microphone, and the man did not take it. At first he spoke in a voice that carried, even without sound, reinforcement, because the room had decided to listen. And he said, "My name is Rafael Morales, and I am here for my daughter. And I am also here because Lumen Harbor is not a bank and not a hedge fund, and not a single wealthy patron. It is a trust built by teachers and nurses and mechanics and line cooks and home health aides, and it is anchored by the pensions of people who cleaned offices at night and served coffee in the morning. And it has purchased a controlling stake in this company because we believe financial technology should serve the people who send money home and pay remittances with fees that cut into dinners and medicine, and because we believe a company that says access should mean it." And the executive stood a few feet away with a smile that could not find purchase. And he said, "Mr. Morales, we would be honored to discuss governance in a proper venue." And the man in green looked at him and said, "We will do that. But right now we are in a proper venue, because this is where your words about belonging were first spoken, and this is where they will be answered." The lobby sound rose like a tide and then fell, because the room did not want to miss a syllable. And the man in green said, "This morning you told me I did not belong, and you threatened to erase my job and to stain my name with words that are cheap to say when you think doors are yours. And I did not raise my voice, because my daughter was watching, and because my mother once said that dignity is the one suit of clothes you can wear every day without it fraying. And I kept it on. And now I will say this with the same voice I used at the rope, and on the nights that I buffed these floors while you slept today. The board of this company has accepted resignations that have been dated not because of what you said to me, though that would have been enough to show your vision was cracked, but because a pattern of arrogance blinds leaders to risk and because we have the votes, we will now remove you as chief executive for cause." And he gestured, and the tall woman in navy stepped forward and read from a letter whose words were plain, even though we do not repeat them here because we keep to a river without punctuation, and the crowd understood the meaning because they could see the pallor in the executive's cheeks and the slow, furious calculation in his eyes as he watched his world tilt from under his shoes. And when the letter concluded, the board members nodded in sequence like a wave, and security deactivated a badge with a click that everyone felt in their bones. And the executive started to speak, and then spoke louder, and then finally poured out a string of explanations that tripped over each other. He said he had been stressed and misinformed, and that he had grown up with less, and that he believed in everyone, and that he was deeply sorry for how things looked and how they felt, and that he would make this right, and that this was a misunderstanding. And he stepped toward the man in green with the expression of someone trying to clasp a hand that will pull him from a cliff. And he said, I am asking you to give me a chance." And the man in green listened with the same attention he had given the supervisor by the service door. And then he answered in the calm that follows a wave that has already broken. And he said, "Your apology is not a bridge. It is a lifeboat for yourself, and it floats only for you, and it comes not from remorse, but from fear, and it is too late." And then he spoke as if he were laying brick, because each word sat on the last, and made a wall that would not fall. And he said, "You stood in a lobby named for power, and told a man who works nights that he did not belong, and you said it with the confidence of someone who was certain the world would agree, and you tried to erase the job that feeds my home and the homes of many like me, and you used the language of order to disguise a prejudice that believes uniforms and accents mark the edges of worth. And then you took aim at my daughter in the softest way, because you believed embarrassment would make us small and quiet, and you were wrong. And because of that, and because of your pattern of contempt disguised as brand protection, you will not lead this place another hour. There is no golden parachute, because this is removal for cause, and your access to the building ends now, and I hope someday you learn what you tried to teach me, but not today." Silence fell with a weight, and then voices rose not in chaos, but in the low sound of people telling each other they had seen something that felt like weather changing, and the executive looked from face to face as if trying to locate one person who would save him and found none, because even the allies, who had liked the way his confidence made them feel powerful, understood that a tide had turned, and the security officer Omar stepped closer, but not in aggression, rather with the reluctance of a man who believes in dignity even for those who did not offer it. And he held out a small envelope for the badge, and the executive stared at it, and thunder flickered behind his eyes, and he handed over the card, because force would only deepen his humiliation. And he said to the man in green, "Do you want me to kneel here because I will, if that is what you want?" And the man in green shook his head and said, "Your kneeling would be theater, and today we need architecture." And he turned to the room and he said, "This is not about revenge, it is about repair." And then he faced the mezzanine and said, "And we begin with a promise. Families of every person who keeps this place standing may sit in the front at every ceremony from this day." And the rope that had cut the lobby in two earlier was lifted and coiled and carried away, and the helix above them caught a reflection of the coil, like a question answered, and the daughter Elena breathed out a breath she had held since the first words of the morning, and her eyes matched her father's steadiness. And the program manager whispered that the calling of names would continue, and the man in green nodded and stepped aside, and the crowd shifted, and the fellowship list was read. And when the daughter heard her own name, she walked with such calm that the noise of applause became a steady band of sound, like wind standing up, and her father did not cheer. He only stood and looked at her in the same way he had looked at her when she first made it across a playground without help. And the cameras that had come for brand captured something more human and more costly than a logo. They captured a choice. After the ceremony, the man in green remained by the edge of the stage, and people approached in ones and twos, and he touched hands and accepted short sentences, carried on trembling breath from employees who said, "My mother cleaned offices too, and I wanted to stay quiet, but not anymore." And the tall woman in navy, who everyone now understood was the chief financial officer, stood by him like the edge of a cliff that has stopped eroding. And she announced with a voice trained to deliver both numbers and news that effective immediately there would be a review of every vendor contract to require wage floors, access to the cafeteria, and clear family inclusion. And that security training would be rewritten so that judgment meant welcoming rather than gatekeeping, and that the signage in the lobby would change, and the language in the offer letters would change, and the executive who no longer had a title watched this proclamation like a man watching furniture being carried out of a house he still calls his, and then a board member known for funding orchestras said simply, "We will pay for dignity." And the sentence surprised the room with its simplicity, and then did the rare thing of immediately becoming true. News traveled in ribbons across the city by radio and phone, and word of mouth and stories appeared that did not caricature the man in green as a miracle but rather told of his hidden struggle and years of night shifts after an accident ended his construction work, and of how he had helped a neighbor fill out forms and watched his neighborhood send small sums each month into a pool that promised to buy back pieces of power, and how he had been elected by other custodians and clerks and paraprofessionals to be the voice in the meetings with lawyers, where documents turned into leverage, and how Lumen Harbor had grown from the idea that capital could be gathered by patience as well as by luck. And suddenly, the city heard that a janitor could also be a trustee, that a father could stand in two truths at once, worker and owner, and this double vision did not seem impossible. It seemed overdue, and the people who had made jokes about service doors took a breath and did not make those jokes for a while, and then a little longer, and maybe not again. The former executive tried to take the story back. He stood in front of a camera without the building behind him, and he spoke about misinterpretation and stress, and his own difficult childhood. And he used words that were smoothed by consultants, but they were pebbles skittering across a surface that would not let them sink. And the comments that followed were sharp, and old colleagues did not defend him because they had seen how swiftly he turned sternness into cruelty whenever someone in a uniform made a mistake, and how he weaponized the phrase, "our standards," to make sure the people who bent their backs also bent their eyes. And in quieter rooms, his closest friend told him, "You forgot that the floor reflects your face when you are looking down." And that sentence stung, not because it was unkind, but because it was true. And he realized that terror is a poor teacher because it goes away as soon as you step out of the classroom, and he was now standing outside. Back in the tower, the man in green met with the night crew in a break room that had always smelled like microwaved soup and lemon cleaner, and today smelled like fresh paint because someone had decided to make a change. You could touch, and he sat with women whose hands had done 1,000 kitchens and men whose knees ached like weather, and he asked them what broke their bodies and what would fix their days. And someone said that the locks click on and off at a time that makes you choose between a bathroom break and finishing on schedule, and the security officer Omar said we can change that day. One, and the chief financial officer said done and wrote it down, and names were written next to every promise, and the man in green watched as the chalkboard filled not with slogans but with tasks, and he felt something that a victory speech never gives you. He felt a plan. At home that night, the daughter sat at their small table and did the thing you do when a day has been both knife and bomb. She ate slowly, and she asked her father if he would ever stop working nights, and he said he would keep doing one shift a week until she told him to stop. And she laughed and said, "I will never tell you to stop, but I will tell you to sleep." And they shared an empanada he had hidden in the lunchbox, and they talked about maps and doors and how people learn. And the next morning they walked past the tower and the rope was gone, and in its place was a sign that said, "Families welcome," in letters large enough that nobody could pretend not to see, and security greeted visitors by name when they could, and with gentle questions when they could not, and people who had always walked with a shadow at their backs found themselves standing a little straighter, and when a man in coveralls arrived with a small boy holding his hand, and asked if this was where the fellowship would be. Next month, Nobody told him to go to the side entrance. They guided him to the front chairs, as if he had bought the building with the price of his care. Months later, the numbers proved what the heart had already felt. Turnover among night staff had fallen. The help desk had fewer complaints. The elevators broke less often because people who felt seen reported small problems before they became large, and the company saved money by spending money. The kind of simple arithmetic that arrogance tends to miss. And the board chair, a woman who had seen cycles and bubbles and corrections said into a microphone, "We found a way to turn capital into community and back again." And that sentence traveled farther than she expected, because it was a new language spoken in an old place. As for the man in green, he kept few trophies. He kept the rope coil in a closet to remind him that objects are only as cruel as the hands that raise them. And he kept the helix reflection in his mind on nights when doubt came whispering, because doubt always comes. And he returned to the building sometimes in daylight to watch a new cohort enter, and he smiled when he saw fathers and mothers in bright and faded clothes sit directly in front, and when he heard someone on stage say the line, "You belong." Because belonging is not something a person earns by being exceptional. It is the starting point from which excellence grows, and sometimes at those events people would look toward him with the warmth that recognizes a person, and he would nod. But he did not stand and wave, because he had already said everything he needed to say with that first calm sentence at the rope, and later with the decision that came after the worst words had been spoken, and the very last time the former executive crossed his path in a city plaza. The man in green offered the same greeting he had for decades. He said, "Good evening," and the former executive started to deliver a fresh round of context. And the man in green lifted a hand gently to stop him and said, "You do not need to explain to me." And the former executive asked what he should do now, and the man said, "Start by sweeping a floor that is not yours. And do it until your back learns the shape of the work you could not see. And after that, go find the people you taught to fear you, and ask them what needs fixing, and then do the quiet part, which is most of it." And then he turned and walked on, and his daughter met him at the corner, and they moved down the block, like any two people carrying groceries and plans, and the city around them breathed in and out, and the tower behind them shone like a lighthouse that had decided finally to point its light inward as well as out. And that is how a sentence thrown like a stone became the first paving of a better road, and how a man in a faded green uniform who kept his dignity like a lantern lit a way through a grand lobby, and then through a grander idea, so that others could walk without shivering and without asking permission, and without ever hearing again the old brittle order that had kept too many standing outside on the wrong side of a rope, while their names were being called inside where only some were meant to belong.